We've all felt the sting of being dismissed, judged by appearance, before anyone bothered to know our story. Sometimes, the ones who look the least impressive turn out to be the most remarkable of all. At St. Denis's elite gentleman's thoroughbred auction, a dirt-covered prospector named Silas Higgins becomes the evening's laughingstock. While wealthy bidders in silk suits sneer, he shuffles forward and pays $10 for a violent stallion headed to the glue factory. The crowd places bets on how fast the killer horse will trample him. But what happens next in that dusty ring will silence every doubter in the room. Could this grimy old cowboy know something about this horse that none of these rich men do? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gaslight chandeliers of the St. Denis auction house cast a warm amber glow across the polished mahogany and brass fixtures that evening in late September of 1887. The air carried the mingled scents of expensive cigars, French perfume, and horse leather, a combination that spoke of wealth and refinement in equal measure. Outside, the Louisiana twilight settled over the city like a silk shawl, but inside this temple of commerce, the energy crackled with anticipation. This was the 23rd annual Gentleman's Thoroughbred Auction, an event that drew the elite from 3 states. Men in tailored suits from New York stood shoulder to shoulder with plantation owners whose lands stretched for thousands of acres. Their wives wore gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, peacock feathers and imported silk announcing status before a single word was spoken. Crystal champagne flutes clinked in gloved hands as the crowd murmured their appraisals of each animal brought before them. The auction block itself stood elevated at the far end of the hall, surrounded by tiered seating upholstered in burgundy velvet. A circular ring of packed dirt occupied the center, where horses could be displayed and examined under the discerning eyes of buyers who knew bloodlines the way scholars knew ancient texts. Tonight's catalogue promised exceptional specimens, racers from Kentucky, working horses from Texas ranches, and breeding stock whose lineage could be traced back to Arabian deserts. Harold Pembroke, the auctioneer, presided over the proceedings with the confidence of a man who understood his value to these proceedings. His silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and his voice carried authority without ever rising to a shout. He'd conducted this auction for 15 years, and in that time he'd sold horses for sums that would make an honest man weep. His gavel was carved ivory, a gift from a grateful buyer who'd purchased a mare that went on to produce 3 racing champions. Near the front row sat Victoria Ashford, a woman of 48 whose inheritance had made her one of the wealthiest landowners in the region. Unlike many of her peers, she'd earned respect through knowledge rather than mere purchasing power. She could evaluate a horse's conformation with a glance, knew which bloodlines produced stamina and which produced speed. Her late husband had taught her well before consumption took him 5 years past. Now she managed their ranch alone, and did so with a skill that silenced those who'd expected her to fail. She wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back simply, her dress elegant but practical. Vanity had never interested her as much as competence. 3 rows behind her, Dutch Calloway sprawled in his seat, with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him deference. His ranch, the Circle C, sprawled across 2 counties, and his reputation for ruthlessness extended even further. He broke horses the way some men broke other men, through force, intimidation, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge any will but his own. His hands bore scars from animals that had fought back, and his eyes held a coldness that never quite reached his smile. Tonight, he'd already purchased 2 horses, both at prices that reflected his determination to own the finest stock, regardless of cost. The auction had been progressing for nearly 3 hours when the main doors at the rear of the hall creaked open. The sound itself wouldn't have drawn attention, but the wave of comments that followed certainly did. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A few women raised lace handkerchiefs to their noses. Silas Higgins stood in the doorway, blinking against the sudden brightness. He was a tall man, though age had begun to curve his shoulders slightly inward. His clothes told the story of hard-travel canvas trousers stained with red clay and trail dust, a shirt that might have been blue once but had faded to something closer to grey. His boots were cracked leather held together by careful stitching and stubbornness. 2 weeks of beard covered his jaw, and his hair hung long beneath a battered hat that had weathered more storms than most men would see in a lifetime. But it was his face that told the real story. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and fanned from his eyes marks left by sun and wind and years spent squinting at distant horizons. His hands, rough and calloused, gripped a worn leather journal against his chest like a man carrying something sacred. Those hands had known honest work, had pulled gold from streams and copper from mountainsides, had gentled horses and built fires in the wilderness. The whispers started immediately. A woman in emerald silk leaned to her companion. Did someone leave the servants' entrance unlocked? A man in a grey suit chuckled. Lost prospector, by the look of him. Someone direct him to the boarding house. The laughter rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, gaining momentum as it spread. Silas heard it all. He'd heard worse in his 62 years. He moved forward with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that hurrying rarely accomplished anything worth doing. His eyes scanned the auction catalogue posted on the wall, searching, always searching. He'd been searching for 3 years. The memory lived in him as vivid as the day it happened. Montana territory, high country where the pine grew thick and the streams ran cold and clear, even in summer. He'd found a good spot for prospecting, a narrow valley where the creek made a bend and deposited sediment that sometimes held color. Not enough to make him rich, but enough to keep him fed and clothed. Enough to live the kind of simple life that suited him. That's where he'd found the mare, dying from a mountain lion's attack. She'd been domestic once, still wore the remnants of a halter, though the leather had rotted through. Some rancher's horse, lost or abandoned. Silas had done what he could for her, but the wounds were too severe. She died at sunset, but not before delivering a foal. The colt had been all legs and uncertainty, a chestnut color that caught the firelight like polished copper. Silas had wrapped the tiny creature in his own bedroll and spent that first night feeding it milk from a rag dipped in canned, condensed milk mixed with water. It wasn't proper colostrum, but it kept the foal alive until morning, when Silas could ride to the nearest ranch and negotiate for proper feed. He'd named him Copper. Over the following months, man and horse became companions in the way that happens when 2 creatures depend on each other for survival. Silas taught the colt to trust human hands, to accept a halter, to walk on a lead rope. In the evenings, as he cooked his simple meals and watched the stars emerge, he'd hum a melody his own father had taught him, a lullaby, really, though Silas had never thought of it that way. Just a tune that settled the mind and eased the day's tensions. Copper would stand nearby, ears forward, listening. The colt grew strong and smart. By his first year, he showed the kind of intelligence that can't be taught, an awareness of his surroundings, a quickness to learn, a trust that ran deeper than training. Silas had plans to break him properly when he turned 2, to teach him to carry a rider with the gentleness that made a horse not just useful, but cherished. Then came the night the raiders arrived. Silas had been asleep when the gunfire started. 3 men, maybe 4, he'd never gotten a clear count. They'd come for his gold, what little he'd accumulated, but they'd taken Copper too. By the time Silas had grabbed his rifle and scrambled from his tent, they were vanishing into the darkness. He'd followed their tracks for 2 days before losing the trail where they'd crossed onto harder ground. That's when the searching began. He'd abandoned his claim, packed what he could carry, and started the methodical process of tracking rumors and following leads. Every town, every ranch, every horse trader and livestock dealer, Silas showed them his sketches of Copper, described the distinctive marking on the colt's left shoulder, asked his questions with patient persistence. The journal he carried became a chronicle of near misses and dead ends, sightings in Wyoming, a possible match in Colorado, another lead in Nebraska. Each one cost him time and money he didn't have, but Silas kept moving. He'd worked any job that would pay, mucking stables, mending fences, hauling freight. The gold dust he'd accumulated over years of prospecting gradually diminished until he carried everything he owned in a leather pouch small enough to fit in his palm. But he never stopped looking, never stopped showing the journal, never stopped asking. 3 months ago, he'd heard about a horse matching Copper's description being sold at a ranch in Texas. By the time he arrived, the animal was gone, sold to a dealer who supplied stock to auction houses. More questions, more patient investigation, more trails that twisted and turned. Then finally, a week ago, he'd learned that a dangerous chestnut stallion was scheduled for the Gentleman's Thoroughbred auction in Saint-Denis. Now he stood in this palace of wealth, surrounded by people who'd never missed a meal or spent a night under the stars unless they chose to. He scanned the lot numbers posted on the board, his weathered finger tracing down the list until he found it. Lot 42. "Excuse me," a nasal voice cut through his concentration. A man in livery, the auction house's head of security, stood, with one hand raised as if directing traffic. "This is a private event. If you're seeking employment, the service entrance is around back." Silas turned slowly. "I'm here for the auction." The guard's expression flickered between amusement and disbelief. "Sir, the minimum bid tonight is $50. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at—" "I have money." Silas's voice carried no anger, just simple fact. He patted the leather pouch at his belt. "I'm here to bid." The guard looked him up and down, clearly skeptical. But Harold Pembroke's voice rang out from the auction block. "Lot 39 has sold for $1,200. We'll take a brief intermission before presenting our final items of the evening." The crowd began to move, some heading toward refreshment tables, others gathering in clusters to discuss the bidding. Silas used the distraction to make his way toward the front, finding a position near the railing that surrounded the ring. The guard watched him, but didn't interfere again. Victoria Ashford noticed him standing there. Something in his bearing caught her attention, the way he held himself despite the obvious poverty, the intensity in his eyes as he stared at that auction block like a man waiting for salvation or judgment. She couldn't quite tell which. She'd seen enough of humanity in her years to recognize authenticity, and this man, whatever else he might be, was genuine in his purpose. Dutch Calloway noticed him too, but his reaction was altogether different. He nudged the man beside him and gestured toward Silas with his chin, saying something that prompted laughter from his companions. Dutch enjoyed mockery the way some men enjoyed fine whiskey frequently and without concern for the aftermath. The intermission ended. Pembroke returned to his position, consulted his notes, and raised his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to the final lots of the evening. I must warn you that our last few items require special consideration." He paused for effect, and in that pause, the rear doors opened again. 2 handlers led a horse into the space behind the ring, a chestnut stallion that fought every step, eyes rolling white with fear or fury or some mixture of both. Even from a distance, even through 3 years of growth and hardship, Silas knew him. He'd found Copper at last. Pembroke's voice took on a different quality as he introduced the lot, something between apology and warning. Lot 42 presents a unique opportunity for the right buyer. This 4-year-old chestnut stallion possesses exceptional bloodlines, but I must be forthright about his temperament. He has proven resistant to traditional breaking methods and has injured 3 handlers in the past month alone. The handlers struggled to bring Copper into the ring. The stallion reared, front hooves pawing at air, muscles rippling beneath a coat that bore the marks of mistreatment. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, thin white lines where whips had fallen repeatedly. His mane was tangled and his ribs showed slightly beneath the skin, evidence of stress and inadequate care. But despite the obvious suffering, he remained magnificent. His conformation was nearly perfect, his legs straight and strong, his chest deep. This was a horse that should have been a treasure, but fear had transformed him into something the wealthy crowd saw as dangerous. "He's destined for the glue factory if we can't find a buyer tonight," Pembroke continued, his tone suggesting this outcome was all but certain. "We'll open bidding at $50, understanding that the buyer assumes all responsibility for the animal's behavior." Silas gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. 3 years of searching, and here was Copper, reduced to this. The colt who'd trusted him completely had been broken by cruelty, though not in the way the auction house believed. This wasn't a horse whose spirit had been destroyed. This was a horse who'd learned that humans meant pain and betrayal. The difference mattered more than these people could understand. The distinctive marking on Copper's left shoulder confirmed what Silas already knew in his bones. It was shaped like a cottonwood leaf, a natural pattern in the chestnut coat that Silas had traced with his fingers countless times during those early months. He'd sketched it in his journal dozens of times, had described it to every horse trader and rancher from Montana to Louisiana. And there it was, exactly as he remembered. The journal fell open in Silas's hands to a page marked with a piece of braided horsehair, all that remained of the halter Copper had worn the night he was stolen. Silas had found it caught on a branch during those first desperate hours of pursuit. He kept it pressed between the pages, like a promise he'd made to himself and to the horse. Next to it was his most detailed sketch, Copper at 6 months old, ears forward, that peculiar intelligence already visible in his eyes. "Do I hear $50? Pembroke scanned the crowd, expecting silence. The wealthy buyers shifted in their seats, some with expressions of pity, others with clear distaste. A dangerous horse was worse than useless. It was a liability. The costs of keeping such an animal far exceeded any possible return. Better to let it go to slaughter and be done with it. Silas pushed away from the railing. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, not from age, but from the weight of this moment. 3 years had led to this. Every mile walked, every odd job taken, every night spent under the stars, wondering if he'd ever find the trail again. All of it came down to the next few seconds. $10! His voice cracked slightly on the words, not from weakness, but from the strain of holding back 3 years of grief and anger and desperate hope. The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone laughed, a single, sharp bark of amusement that broke the dam. The laughter spread like fire through dry grass. Men slapped their knees. Women hid smiles behind their hands. Even some of the staff exchanged amused glances. "I'm sorry. Did you say $10? Pembroke's expression suggested he'd misheard. $10, Silas repeated, louder now, his voice carrying across the hall. He stepped forward into the aisle, and the crowd got its first clear look at him, the trail dust, the worn clothes, the weathered face. The laughter intensified. Dutch Calloway stood up, his bulk making the movement noticeable even in the crowd. "Let him have it," he called out, voice thick with mockery. "I want to see this. Boys, I'll bet $20 that crazy horse throws him in under 5 seconds. 30 says it's under 3, another man shouted, and suddenly the auction hall transformed into an impromptu betting parlor. Money changed hands. Someone produced a pocket watch to serve as official timekeeper. The spectacle had become entertainment, and Silas was the unwitting performer in their show. Pembroke looked uncertain, glancing toward the auction house's owner, who stood near the wall. The owner shrugged. They were going to lose money on this animal regardless. At least this way they'd be rid of it. And the crowd seemed amused by the prospect. Bad business, perhaps, but memorable, and memorable was often good for future attendance. "Very well," Pembroke said, his gavel hovering. "Lot 42, sold to the gentleman for $10. Sir, you'll need to settle your account before taking possession." Silas was already moving toward the ring, but Pembroke held up one hand. "Payment first, if you please." The leather pouch at Silas's belt held every cent he owned. He'd panned it from streams across 3 territories, grain by grain, over years of patient work. At current prices, it represented nearly $300 worth of gold dust, a fortune to a prospector, though barely enough to interest the people in this room. He could have bid higher, could have tried to appear legitimate by offering a sum closer to what these horses actually cost. But pride had never been his weakness, and pretending to be something he wasn't served no purpose. He loosened the drawstring and poured a careful measure into Pembroke's hand, enough to cover the $10 bid and the auction house's commission. The gold caught the gaslight, glinting like captured sunlight. Pembroke's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't dust swept from the floor of some played-out mine. This was quality color, carefully collected and preserved. The prospector had money after all, which made his insulting bid all the more puzzling. "Your change," Pembroke began, but Silas shook his head. "Keep it. Consider it payment for whatever he's cost you in damaged fences." He tied the pouch closed again and turned toward the ring. The handlers had retreated to what they considered a safe distance. Copper stood in the center of the packed dirt circle, sides heaving, eyes wild. The horse was scanning for threats, for the next source of pain. His ears lay flat against his skull, and his weight shifted constantly, ready to bolt, to strike, to do whatever survival demanded. "Sir, I strongly advise against entering that ring," Pembroke called out. "We have no medical staff on premises, and that animal has already—" But Silas had already climbed the fence. The crowd surged forward, pressing against the railing. The betting intensified. Someone called for quiet so the timekeeper could concentrate. Dutch Calloway leaned forward in his seat, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Victoria Ashford found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't have explained why this stranger's fate suddenly mattered to her. Silas stood just inside the ring, making no move to approach the horse. His boots settled into the dirt with the solid weight of a man who knew how to find his balance. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his battered hat. His long hair fell past his shoulders, grey mixing with what had once been dark brown. He held the hat against his chest, his other hand empty and visible at his side. Then he began to hum. The melody was simple, not quite a song, not quite just sound. It had the rhythm of water moving over stones, of wind through pine branches, of something old and patient and utterly without threat. Silas had hummed it while panning for gold in cold mountain streams. He'd hummed it while cooking beans over a campfire, and he'd hummed it every evening as the sun set and Copper stood nearby, a growing colt who found comfort in the sound. Copper's ears swiveled forward. The change was so slight that most of the crowd didn't notice, but Silas saw it. He took one step forward, his feet moving to the rhythm of the melody. The humming continued, rising and falling like breath itself. The stallion's nostrils flared, his head lowered slightly, no longer scanning for aerial threats. Some deep, buried memory stirred a time before whips, before chains, before the world taught him that humans meant suffering. A time when this sound meant safety and warmth and someone who asked nothing except to share space in the long Montana twilight. Silas took another step. His voice joined the humming now. Words too soft for the crowd to hear, but pitched perfectly for the horse. "Easy now, Copper. Easy, son. It's me, boy. It's me." The betting fell silent. The laughter died. In the sudden quiet, Silas's voice carried across the ring like a bridge spanning 3 years of separation and suffering, reaching for a connection that cruelty had tried to sever but couldn't quite destroy. Copper took one hesitant step forward, then another. The violence in his stance began to dissolve like frost under morning sun. His ears remained forward now, locked onto the source of that impossible familiar sound. Memory worked differently in horses than in men, less about words or images, and more about feeling, about the deep imprint left by consistent treatment. Copper didn't remember Montana in the way humans remember places. He remembered how safety felt. He remembered this particular voice, this specific melody, this one human who had never raised a hand in anger. Silas extended his palm, empty and open, at shoulder height. No rope, no whip, no halter or bit, or any of the tools that the handlers had tried to force upon Copper over these long months. Just calloused skin and fingers stained with honest dirt, the hand of a man who gentled a frightened colt in the wilderness and never once demanded more than trust. The stallion's muzzle stretched forward, nostrils working to capture scent. 3 feet separated them now. Then, 2. The crowd had forgotten to breathe. Even Dutch Calloway's mocking smile had faltered, replaced by something closer to confusion. When Copper's nose touched Silas's palm, the old prospector's eyes closed briefly. His throat worked, swallowing back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm his composure. "There you are," he whispered. "There's my good boy. I looked everywhere for you, everywhere." The horse huffed out a breath that stirred the dust between them. His head pushed forward, pressing against Silas's chest with enough force to make the man take a small step backward. Then Copper's forehead rested against Silas's sternum, the full weight of his skull seeking the kind of contact that had once been as natural as breathing. A sound emerged from the horse's chest, not quite a whinny, but something deeper, more mournful. The sound of reunion mixed with reproach. "Where did you go? Why did you leave me?" Silas wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, his weathered hands running through the tangled mane. He felt every scar under his palms, catalogued each cruelty that Copper had endured. The whip marks on the flanks, the rope burns around the pasterns where hobbles had been tied too tight, the tension in muscles that had learned to expect pain from every human interaction. Anger built in Silas's chest, a cold, controlled fury at the men who'd stolen a trusting colt and spent 3 years teaching him fear. But anger could wait. Right now, only this moment mattered. His father's voice echoed across the decades, a memory as clear as yesterday. They'd been standing in a corral behind the family homestead in Missouri, and young Silas had been maybe 12 years old, struggling with a green-broke mare who kept shying from the saddle. His father had put a hand on his shoulder and spoken words that became a philosophy. "Listen to me, son. A horse remembers kindness longer than pain. You can break a horse's spirit with a whip, make it obey through fear, but that's not horsemanship, that's just cruelty dressed up as dominance. The ones you take time with, the ones you earn trust from, they'll carry you through storms and stand steady when the world's falling apart. That's the difference between riding a slave and partnering with a friend." His father had died when Silas was 17, kicked by a stallion he'd been trying to break too quickly, pressed by a buyer who wanted immediate results. The irony wasn't lost on Silas. His father had violated his own principles in pursuit of a sale, and it had cost him everything. That lesson had stayed with Silas through all the years that followed. Patience wasn't just virtue, it was survival. He stepped back now, giving Copper space, and began moving his hands in long, steady strokes down the horse's neck and shoulders. The systematic touch served multiple purposes. It soothed, yes, but it also assessed. Silas was checking for injuries, for points of soreness, for any damage that might require immediate attention. His fingers found a thickened area along the left shoulder where an old wound had healed poorly. A kick from another horse, most likely, during some crowded pen situation where frightened animals had been packed too closely together. "They didn't take care of you," Silas murmured, continuing his examination. "Treated you like cargo instead of a living creature. That's going to change now. That's over." The crowd remained silent, transfixed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't the violent spectacle they'd anticipated. No trampling, no blood, no comedic conclusion to their evening's entertainment. Instead, they were watching something that existed outside their experience, a connection that rendered their wealth and status irrelevant. In this ring, in this moment, only 2 beings mattered, and neither of them wore silk or carried a bank draft. Silas walked around Copper's left side, trailing his hand along the horse's body so the touch never broke. Copper's head turned, tracking the movement, but his feet remained planted. When Silas reached the hindquarters, he paused at a particularly ugly scar that ran from hip to hock. Someone had used a knife there, probably to force the horse into a trailer or stall. The rage that Silas had been containing threatened to surface, but he pushed it down again. Anger could wait. Healing couldn't. He completed the circle, returning to Copper's head. The stallion's eyes had changed. The wildness remained that couldn't be erased in moments, but underneath it, recognition had taken root. This human was different. This human remembered him. "We're going to try something now," Silas said softly, speaking as much to himself as to the horse. "If you're not ready, that's fine. We'll take our time. But I think you remember this part." He gathered Copper's mane in his left hand, positioned himself along the horse's left side, and placed his right hand on the stallion's withers. No saddle, no stirrup. Just the way he'd first taught a yearling colt to accept a rider's weight in a Montana valley that seemed like another world now. Victoria Ashford leaned forward in her seat. She recognized what she was seeing. Classical horsemanship, the kind practiced by the old Spanish masters, where trust preceded control and partnership superseded dominance. She'd read about such methods in books imported from Europe, but she'd never expected to see them demonstrated by a dirt-covered prospector in a Louisiana auction house. Dutch Calloway's jaw clenched. Something about this display bothered him on a level he couldn't quite articulate. He'd built his reputation on breaking horses quickly, efficiently, through methods that left no room for negotiation. Watching this old man gentle, a killer stallion without rope or whip, felt like an indictment of everything Dutch represented. Silas applied gentle pressure, asking rather than demanding. Copper tensed, muscle memory from recent trauma making him hesitate. But then slowly, carefully, the stallion shifted his weight, accepting the burden. Silas eased upward, his movements fluid despite his age, and found himself seated bareback on the horse he'd travelled 3 years and 1,000 miles to find. Copper stood absolutely still, processing. Then his head turned, looking back at the weight on his spine, at the man who sat there with the patience of stone. Recognition deepened into something approaching peace. The wild edge that had defined every interaction for months began to soften. This was familiar. This was right. This was how things should be. Silas shifted his weight slightly to the left, applying the barest pressure with his leg. Copper responded immediately, turning in a smooth arc without any guidance from reins or rope. The movement was precise, controlled, the kind of responsiveness that spoke to training so deeply ingrained it had survived 3 years of abuse and separation. They completed the circle, and Silas shifted again, asking for the opposite direction. Copper obliged without hesitation. The crowd watched in stunned silence as man and horse began to move through increasingly complex patterns. A figure 8, each loop perfectly symmetrical. A side pass, Copper's legs crossing over each other with careful deliberation. A backing sequence that demonstrated the horse's willingness to trust, despite not seeing where he was going. Each movement flowed into the next, with the kind of harmony that wealthy buyers paid thousands to witness in trained dressage horses. But this wasn't a performance rehearsed over months in a controlled environment. This was muscle memory and trust, pure and simple. This was the result of a foundation laid with patience in a wilderness camp, of hours spent teaching a young colt that human requests were invitations rather than demands, that cooperation brought reward rather than punishment. Silas brought Copper to a halt in the center of the ring and dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent a lifetime climbing on and off horses. He ran his hand down Copper's neck one final time, then turned to face the crowd. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held quiet certainty. "This horse was stolen from me 3 years ago in Montana territory," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Took from my camp in the night by raiders who also stole what gold I'd accumulated. I've been tracking him ever since." The silence broke. Voices erupted in confusion and disbelief. Pembroke raised his hands, calling for order. But before he could speak, Dutch Calloway stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made several people flinch. "That's a damned lie," Dutch growled, his face flushed with anger or something that looked convincingly like righteous indignation. I bought that horse legitimate from a trader in Wyoming 6 months ago, paid good money for him too, before I realized he was useless. Silas reached into his coat and withdrew the worn leather journal. He held it up so the crowd could see. Every place I searched is documented in here. Every sighting, every lead, every person who might have seen him. I've got sketches made when he was just months old, showing that marking on his shoulder. I've got dates and descriptions that match exactly. Drawings prove nothing, Dutch shot back. Any man can sketch a horse and claim it's his. I've got a bill of sale from a licensed trader. That's legal documentation. Victoria Ashford rose to her feet, her voice cutting through the growing chaos with practiced authority. Mr. Calloway, if you sold this horse to the auction house, that means you were aware of his condition. You knew he'd been mistreated, knew he was scheduled for slaughter, and yet you never mentioned that you were the original owner who bought him legitimate. That seems peculiar, doesn't it? Dutch's eyes narrowed. What are you implying, Victoria? I'm not implying anything, she replied coolly. I'm observing. We just witnessed this gentleman demonstrate a connection with that horse that clearly predates any recent acquisition. The animal responded to techniques that require months, if not years, of consistent training. That level of responsiveness doesn't appear spontaneously. The old man's a horse charmer, someone called from the crowd. Uses tricks, probably drugs the animals. I've heard of such men. Silas shook his head slowly. No tricks, no drugs, just time and patience and a bond that started when this horse was barely steady on his feet. I raised him from a newborn colt after his mama died from a mountain lion attack, fed him with a rag dipped in condensed milk until I could get proper feed. Spent every day teaching him that humans could be trusted. His voice roughened slightly. Then I failed him. Wasn't watching careful enough when those raiders came. They took him, and I've been trying to make that right ever since. Pembroke had regained control of his composure. Gentlemen, lady, please. This is clearly a matter that exceeds the scope of an auction house. We need proper authorities to mediate this dispute. The sale has been completed, payment has been rendered, but obviously there are questions that require investigation. I'm taking my horse and leaving, Silas said simply. He turned back toward Copper, reaching for the makeshift lead rope one of the handlers had abandoned. The hell you are. Dutch started down from his seat, his bulk making him formidable despite his age. 2 men who'd been sitting near him followed hired hands. By their look, men accustomed to following orders and not particular about their nature. The tension in the room shifted from confusion to something more dangerous. People near the ring backed away, creating space as if sensing the potential for violence. Silas stood his ground, his hand still resting on Copper's neck. The horse sensed the change in atmosphere, ears swiveling, muscles tensing again. The main doors opened, and Sheriff Duncan Macready stepped into the hall. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a salt and pepper mustache, and the calm demeanor of someone who'd dealt with enough conflict to know that most of it was preventable if handled properly. His presence brought a momentary pause to the confrontation. "Evening, folks," Macready said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, not threatening, just present. "Got a report of a disturbance. Seems maybe that report was accurate." Pembroke moved quickly to intercept him. "Sheriff, we have a disputed sale. This gentleman," he gestured toward Silas, "claims the horse he just purchased was stolen from him 3 years ago. Mr. Calloway, who sold the horse to us, disputes this claim." Macready's eyes moved from Dutch to Silas, taking in the prospector's worn appearance, the journal still clutched in his hand, the way the supposedly dangerous horse stood calmly beside him. He developed instincts about people, about situations, about the distance between what folks claimed and what was actually true. "I know you," he said, looking at Silas. "Or rather, I know of you. Your description's been posted in my office and half the sheriff's offices between here and Montana. Not wanted for crimes, mind you. Wanted for information about a stolen horse. You're the prospector who's been searching." Silas nodded. Silas Higgins, and I've found what I was looking for. That's real touching, Dutch interjected. But it doesn't change the fact that I've got legal ownership. The horse was sold to me fair and square, and I sold him fair and square to this auction house. Everything documented and proper. Macready pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Let's sort this out reasonable-like. Mr. Higgins, you've got documentation of your search? Silas handed over the journal. Macready flipped through the pages, his expression thoughtful. Years of entries, sketches that showed the same horse at different ages, notes about sightings and dead ends. It was either an elaborate deception maintained over years, or it was exactly what it appeared to be, the desperate record of a man trying to recover something stolen. And Mr. Calloway, you have this bill of sale you mentioned? Dutch's hesitation was brief, but noticeable. Back at my ranch. Didn't think I'd need it for a horse I was getting rid of. Convenient, Victoria murmured, loud enough to carry. The sheriff closed the journal and looked at both men. Here's what's going to happen. Mr. Higgins, you've paid for this horse and completed the sale as far as the auction house is concerned. But Mr. Calloway's raised questions about ownership that need addressing. I'm going to ask you both to come by my office tomorrow morning with whatever documentation you've got. We'll get this straightened out proper and legal. I'm not leaving without my horse, Silas said quietly. Didn't ask you to, Macready replied. The horse is yours by purchase. But if Mr. Calloway can prove legitimate ownership prior to that sale, we might have to revisit the matter. That's just how law works. Dutch looked like he wanted to argue, but the presence of the sheriff and the attention of dozens of witnesses stayed his hand. Whatever he'd planned to do, intimidation, force, or simple obstruction, it would have to wait for a less public venue. The auction house emptied slowly, wealthy patrons departing in their carriages while casting backward glances at the grimy prospector and the horse that had proven everyone wrong. Silas stood near the ring, one hand resting on Copper's neck, feeling the gradual easing of tension in the stallion's muscles. The horse was still processing. 3 years of learned fear didn't vanish in an evening, no matter how profound the reunion. Victoria Ashford approached once most of the crowd had dispersed. She moved carefully, telegraphing her intentions, aware that both man and horse might be wary of strangers after the night's events. Mr. Higgins, she said, stopping at a respectful distance. I'm Victoria Ashford. I manage a ranch about 10 miles north of the city. If you need a place to stable your horse while this legal matter gets sorted, you're welcome to use my facilities. Silas studied her, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He'd learned long ago that kindness often came with strings attached, that generosity from wealthy folks usually served their purposes more than yours. But he'd also learned to recognize the genuine article when he saw it, and something in this woman's bearing suggested she meant what she said. That's generous of you, ma'am, he replied, but I don't have means to pay boarding fees, and I don't take charity. I'm not offering charity, Victoria said. My head groom injured his back last week and I'm short-handed. You look like a man who knows his way around horses. Work in exchange for room and board for you and your animal. Fair trade, not charity. Copper shifted beside Silas, his ears swiveling toward Victoria's voice. The horse was listening, evaluating. Silas felt the movement and made his decision based partly on practical need and partly on the fact that Copper hadn't shown signs of distress at the woman's approach. Horses had good instincts about people, better than humans did in some ways. I accept, Silas said, but just until this matter with Calloway is settled, I'm not looking to put down roots. Understood. Victoria glanced toward the doorway, where Dutch had exited 15 minutes earlier, his face dark with anger. I should warn you, Dutch Calloway doesn't take well to being crossed, especially not in public. He's going to fight this ownership question hard, and he's not particular about his methods. I've dealt with difficult men before, Silas replied. 3 years on the trail taught me that persistence matters more than strength. Victoria nodded and gave him directions to her ranch, then departed in a modest carriage that spoke of wealth but not ostentation. Silas waited until the auction house was nearly empty before leading Copper toward the exit. The horse moved with him willingly now, staying close without needing a rope. They walked through the streets of Saint-Denis as night settled fully over the city, passing beneath gas lamps that cast pools of amber light across the cobblestones. Copper startled at a sudden noise, a dog barking behind a fence, and pressed against Silas's shoulder. The old prospector steadied him with a hand and voice, the same low humming that had bridged 3 years of separation. "Easy now. Just a dog. Nothing to fear here. You're safe now, boy. I've got you." The words were as much promise as comfort. Silas had found his horse, but recovery would take time. The scars on Copper's body would fade eventually, but the deeper wounds, the ones that made him flinch at sudden movements, that turned ordinary sounds into potential threats, those would require patience to heal. Silas had patience. It was perhaps the one commodity he possessed in abundance. They reached the edge of the city where buildings gave way to open land. The night air carried the scent of river water and grass, cleaner than the city's smoke and dust. Copper's pace quickened slightly, recognizing open space as something closer to natural. Silas felt the shift and allowed the horse to walk beside him rather than behind, sharing the road as equals. The moon had risen by the time they reached Victoria's ranch. The main house sat back from the road, a 2-story structure of whitewashed wood with wide porches. To the left, a large barn showed light through the cracks in its doors. Silas led Copper toward it, finding Victoria waiting with a groom, a young man who looked uncertain about his role in this late-night arrival. "The end stall is clean and ready," Victoria said, gesturing toward the barn's interior. "Fresh water and hay. I took the liberty of having our veterinarian stop by earlier. He left some salve for those wounds and instructions for proper nutrition. Your horse is underweight." Silas nodded. He'd noted that already, along with the dull quality to Copper's coat, the way his ribs showed through despite the muscle beneath. He'll need careful feeding. Too much rich food too fast will make him sick. Has to be gradual. "I know," Victoria replied. "I've rehabilitated neglected animals before. It's a process." They settled Copper in the stall, a corner box stall with good ventilation and thick bedding. The horse explored his new surroundings cautiously, sniffing at the walls, testing the hay with his nose before taking a mouthful. Silas stayed nearby, providing the reassurance of his presence, while Copper adjusted to yet another change in circumstances. Victoria showed Silas to a small room in the barn's loft, a space normally used by seasonal help, furnished simply with a cot, a chair, and a washstand. A lantern already burned on the small table, casting warm light across rough-hewn walls. It was more shelter than Silas had enjoyed in months, and he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest at the kindness. "There's a well outside for washing up," Victoria said from the doorway. "Breakfast is at 6 in the main house, but if you're not comfortable with that, I can have food brought out here." "The house is fine," Silas replied. He hesitated, then added, "Thank you, ma'am. This is more than I expected when I walked into that auction tonight." Victoria's expression softened. "I watched what happened in that ring. I've been around horses my entire life, and I've never seen anything quite like that connection. Whatever Dutch Calloway claims, that horse knew you. That matters more than any bill of sale." After she left, Silas descended the loft stairs and stood outside Copper's stall. The horse had finished eating and now stood with his head lowered, the first genuine relaxation Silas had seen since the reunion. He spoke softly, running through memories aloud, telling Copper about the search the towns visited, the dead ends followed, the nights when giving up seemed like the sensible choice. "But I couldn't quit," Silas murmured. "Couldn't leave you out there alone, couldn't accept that someone had taken you, and that was just how things were. Your mama died bringing you into this world. I owed her the debt of keeping you safe, owed you the promise I made when I first held you, that I'd be the kind of human worth trusting." Copper's ear flicked toward the sound of his voice. The horse took a step closer to the stall door, bringing his head to where Silas could reach it. The old prospector rested his forehead against the stallions, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the steady breathing that proved this wasn't another dream that would dissolve upon waking. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Sheriff McCready wanted documentation, Dutch Calloway wanted revenge, and the law would demand proof that might not exist in forms that courts recognized. But tonight, in this quiet barn under a Louisiana sky so different from Montana's mountains, Silas had what he'd searched 3 years to find. Tonight, that was enough. Dawn arrived with the sound of roosters and the stirring of horses in their stalls. Silas had been awake for an hour already, old habits from prospecting days, making sleep past first light feel like laziness. He'd checked on Copper twice during the night, needing to confirm that the reunion was real, that he hadn't imagined finding the horse after 3 years of searching. The morning air carried autumn's first hint of coolness. Silas washed at the well, the cold water shocking him fully awake, then made his way to the main house where Victoria had said breakfast would be served. He felt awkward approaching the elegant home in his trail-worn clothes, but Victoria met him at the door with no sign of judgment. "Coffee," she offered, leading him to a kitchen larger than most prospectors' entire camps. The room smelled of bacon and fresh bread, scents that made Silas realize he couldn't remember his last proper meal. They ate at a simple table in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. Victoria's choice, Silas noted, as if she understood that fancy settings would make him uncomfortable. She asked questions about his search, and he found himself answering with a candor that surprised him. There was something about this woman that invited honesty. Maybe it was the way she listened without interrupting, or the way she didn't offer empty platitudes about things working out fine. "Montana to Louisiana is a long way," she said, pouring more coffee. 3 years is a long time. Only way to stop would have been to give up," Silas replied, "and I don't know how to do that. My father used to say a man's worth is measured by what he does when nobody's watching, when there's no reward except knowing you did right." Finding Copper wasn't about the horse's monetary value. It was about not being the kind of man who abandons something he's responsible for. Victoria studied him over her coffee cup. "You're an unusual person, Mr. Higgins. Most people would have declared the horse lost and moved on with their lives. Most people have lives to move on with," Silas said quietly. "I had a claim in Montana that probably got jumped the moment I left. Had a few acquaintances in various mining camps, but nobody I'd call close. Copper was the nearest thing to family I had. Couldn't just let him go." After breakfast, Silas began the work Victoria had offered as payment for lodging. The ranch ran smoothly despite being short-handed, testimony to good management and well-trained staff. He mucked stalls, repaired fence line, and helped exercise some of the younger horses. The work felt good, honest labor with visible results, so different from the endless searching that had consumed the past 3 years. Between tasks, he spent time with Copper. The horse was eating better now, taking to the careful feeding regimen Victoria's veterinarian had prescribed. The worst of the whip scars were responding to treatment, though some would leave permanent marks. Silas worked with Copper in the round pen, not training so much as rebuilding trust, letting the horse remember what partnership felt like instead of coercion. Victoria watched from the fence during one of these sessions. "You never use a whip," she observed, "not even for guidance." "Don't need one," Silas replied, his attention on Copper as the horse circled at a trot. "A whip teaches fear. I need him to remember that I'm safe, that we're a team. Fear's faster, but trust lasts longer." "My late husband would have appreciated your methods," Victoria said softly. "He believed similar things, though he never managed to convince the other ranchers in the area. Dutch Calloway especially mocked him for what he called soft horsemanship. Calloway doesn't strike me as a man who understands the difference between respect and fear," Silas said. "He doesn't," Victoria agreed, "which is why I need to warn you. He rode past the property line this morning. Didn't stop, but he was making a point. He knows you're here." That afternoon, Sheriff McCready visited. He dismounted near the barn and approached Silas with the careful neutrality of a man trying to maintain impartiality. "Mr. Higgins, come by to check on your situation. Appreciate that." "Sheriff," Silas said, setting aside the leather tack he'd been mending. "Any word from Calloway about that bill of sale?" Macready's expression told the story before his words did. He produced documentation, a bill of sale, from a trader named Roscoe Jenkins in Wyoming Territory, dated 6 months ago. "Looks legitimate on the surface." Silas felt his stomach tighten. "Did you check with this Jenkins fellow?" "Sent a telegram. Haven't heard back yet, and won't be surprised if I don't. Jenkins has a reputation for questionable dealings. The kind of man who might sell a stolen horse and provide documentation to match." The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "But here's the interesting part. I did some checking into Dutch Calloway's recent activities. Seems he made a trip to Wyoming about 6 months ago, and according to local records, he was in the same town where Jenkins operates around the time of that alleged sale. So Calloway might have sold the horse to Jenkins just to buy it back with clean papers," Silas said, understanding the scheme immediately. "That's speculation on my part," Macready replied carefully. "Can't prove it without more evidence, but it struck me as mighty convenient that Dutch happens to have purchased from a trader known for laundering stolen livestock. What does this mean for me and Copper? Legally, Calloway has documentation and you don't. That puts him in a stronger position if this goes before a judge." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Morally, I believe you, Mr. Higgins. I've seen enough in my years to recognize an honest man, and you're one. But the law doesn't always align with what's right. It aligns with what can be proven." After Macready left, Silas stood in the barn doorway watching the afternoon light angle across the paddocks. 3 years of searching, and it might end with losing Copper again, this time through legal maneuvering rather than outright theft. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but anger wouldn't solve anything. He needed to think. Victoria found him there as sunset approached. She stood beside him without speaking for a long moment, then said, "There's something you should know about Dutch Calloway. My husband opposed him on a water rights issue 5 years ago. Dutch tried everything to force him to back down: intimidation, economic pressure, even threats. When none of that worked, there was a convenient accident. A fence that had been maintained for years suddenly gave way, and my husband's horse threw him. He broke his neck." Silas looked at her sharply. "You think Calloway was responsible?" "I couldn't prove it," Victoria said. "But yes, I believe he was. The fence had been tampered with, but by the time I thought to check, any evidence was long gone. Dutch is careful. He doesn't leave tracks that lead back to him." "Sounds like you're warning me," Silas said. "I am," Victoria replied. "Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, Dutch won't let this rest. You humiliated him in front of the entire auction house, proved him wrong in the most public way possible. Men like him don't forgive that kind of damage to their pride. You need to watch yourself, and watch your horse even more carefully." That night, Silas moved his bedroll into Copper's stall. The horse stood nearby as the old prospector settled into the straw, accepting the presence without alarm. They'd spent countless nights like this in Montana, man and growing colt finding comfort in proximity. Some things, it seemed, survived even 3 years of separation. "We've got a fight coming," Silas murmured into the darkness. "Same fight we've been in since they took you. Only difference now is I know where you are. That's something, at least. That's more than I've had in a long time." Copper's breathing deepened into sleep, but Silas stayed awake longer, planning. The law might favor Calloway's paperwork, but there had to be another way. 3 years of persistence had brought him this far. He wasn't about to let a corrupt trader's false documentation undo everything he'd sacrificed to accomplish. The revelation came 3 days later, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet persistence of detail. Silas had been grooming Copper in the morning light, working methodically through the tangles in the stallion's mane, when his fingers encountered something he'd missed before. Behind Copper's left ear, hidden beneath the long mane, was a small brand mark, crude and partially healed over, but still visible when the hair was parted just right. It wasn't a standard ranch brand, it was a pair of initials, D.C. Silas's hands stilled. He parted the mane more carefully, examining the mark in better light. The brand was old at least 3 years, judging by how the scar tissue had matured. It had been placed deliberately but not skillfully, as if someone wanted to mark ownership without caring about proper technique or the animal's comfort. The location suggested concealment, a mark meant to establish claim without being immediately obvious. Dutch Calloway. The initials matched perfectly. But if Dutch had branded Copper 3 years ago, that meant he'd owned the horse before the alleged purchase from Roscoe Jenkins 6 months back. It meant he'd lied about when he acquired the animal. More than that, it suggested he'd been involved in the original theft. Why else brand a horse in such a hidden, crude manner unless you were trying to establish ownership of something stolen? Silas's mind raced through the implications. 3 years ago, raiders had hit his Montana camp. He'd assumed they were random thieves, opportunists who'd stumbled across his isolated site and decided to take what they could. But what if it hadn't been random? What if someone had known about the colt, had specifically targeted Silas's camp for that purpose? He left Copper in the stall and went to find Victoria. She was in her study, reviewing ledgers, but looked up immediately when she saw his expression. "I found something," Silas said without preamble. He described the brand, watching her face shift from curiosity to understanding to cold anger. "That changes everything," she said. "If Dutch branded that horse 3 years ago, his bill of sale from Jenkins is fraudulent. He didn't acquire the horse 6 months ago, he's had it all along." "More than that," Silas said. "It means he was likely involved in stealing Copper from me in the first place. Random thieves don't brand the horses they steal. But someone planning to keep and sell an animal later might." Victoria stood and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner. She pulled out a folder and spread several papers across her desk. 3 years ago, in October, there were a series of livestock thefts across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. My husband tracked them because he had business connections in those territories. The pattern suggested organized rustling rather than opportunistic theft. Targets were carefully chosen, and the stolen animals disappeared completely. No traces. She pointed to a map where her husband had marked the incidents. "Look at the dates and locations. Your camp in Montana was hit on October 12th, 1884. 2 weeks later, a breeding facility in Wyoming lost 3 horses. A month after that, a ranch in Idaho had 5 animals vanish overnight. My husband suspected the same group was responsible for all of them." "Did he find out who?" Silas asked. "No. He died before he could complete his investigation, but he'd narrowed it down to 3 possible operations that had the resources and connections to move stolen livestock across territories. One of them was based in Wyoming." She pulled out another paper, and Silas saw a name that made his blood run cold. Jenkins Trading Company. "Roscoe Jenkins," Silas said. "The same man who allegedly sold Copper to Dutch." "Not allegedly," Victoria corrected. "Jenkins definitely provided that bill of sale, but I'm willing to bet Dutch already owned the horse and paid Jenkins to create backdated documentation. It's a common scheme among rustlers: steal an animal, hold it for a period, then legitimately purchase it through a corrupt dealer who'll swear the transaction was clean." Silas sank into a chair, the weight of discovery pressing down on him. So Dutch was one of the raiders, or he hired them. Either way, he orchestrated the theft of my horse 3 years ago, then spent those years profiting off him while I spent everything I had trying to find him. "The question is why," Victoria said. "Dutch owns hundreds of horses. Why go through such elaborate measures to steal one colt from a prospector's camp?" "Copper's sire," Silas said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "I never knew what bloodline his mother came from, just found her dying, tried to help." But if she was valuable breeding stock that someone had lost or stolen before, then Copper might have lineage worth a fortune. Dutch would have known. He's got connections to every horse trader and breeder in 3 states. He'd recognize valuable bloodlines even in a half-dead mare. Victoria's eyes widened. If Copper's mother was stolen from someone else, then found her way to where you discovered her, Dutch might have been tracking her. When he found out she'd foaled before dying, he'd want that colt. The bloodline would continue through Copper. So he sent raiders to take what he saw as rightfully his, Silas finished. Never mind that I'd saved the foal's life, raised him, earned his trust. Dutch saw property and took it. They stared at each other across the desk, the implications spinning out in multiple directions. This wasn't just about a stolen horse anymore. It was about proving that Dutch Calloway had orchestrated theft, fraud, and possibly more. It was about exposing a conspiracy that stretched across territories and involved corrupt dealers who made their living laundering stolen livestock. "We need to take this to Sheriff McCready," Victoria said. "That brand is physical evidence that contradicts Dutch's timeline." "Will it be enough?" Silas asked. "Dutch will claim he branded the horse after he bought it from Jenkins, that the brand date doesn't prove anything about when he acquired ownership." "Possibly," Victoria admitted, "but combined with my late husband's investigation notes and the pattern of thefts, it builds a case. We can prove Dutch had motive, means, and opportunity. We can show that Jenkins has a history of providing false documentation for stolen livestock. We can demonstrate that Dutch's story doesn't hold up to scrutiny." Silas stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the barn where Copper was stalled. "Dutch won't let this go to court. If we expose his connection to those thefts, we're not just threatening his ownership of one horse. We're threatening his entire operation, his reputation, maybe his freedom if the law decides to investigate deeper. Which means he'll act before we can present this evidence," Victoria said quietly. "He'll try to take the horse back by force or destroy the evidence. Or," she hesitated, then continued, "or eliminate the witnesses." "You mean me," Silas said. "I mean both of us," Victoria corrected. "I've become complicit in this by helping you. Dutch knows that. He also knows that I've been trying to prove he killed my husband for 5 years. This gives him another reason to want me silenced." The room fell quiet, except for the ticking of a mantel clock. Silas had come to Louisiana seeking only to reclaim what was stolen. He hadn't intended to uncover a criminal enterprise or put anyone else at risk. But intentions mattered less than reality, and the reality was that they'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple property dispute. "We take it to McCready today," Silas decided. "Give him everything, the brand, the investigation notes, the timeline. Let the law handle it from there. I won't risk your safety for my horse, no matter how much he means to me." Victoria smiled slightly, a sad expression that held recognition of sacrifice. "You would, though, walk away from Copper if it meant keeping others safe. That's exactly the kind of man you are." She gathered the papers back into the folder. "But I'm not letting you make that choice. My husband started this investigation because he believed in justice. I'm finishing it because I believe in the same thing. Dutch Calloway has operated with impunity for too long." They rode into town together that afternoon, Silas on a borrowed mount and Victoria in her carriage. The folder of evidence rested between them like a loaded weapon, dangerous but necessary. As they passed through the ranch gates, neither noticed the figure watching from the tree line, or the way that figure turned his horse and rode quickly toward the Circle C ranch, with news that Dutch Calloway would pay handsomely to hear. Sheriff McCready's office occupied a modest building on Main Street, sandwiched between the telegraph office and a general store. Inside, the smell of coffee and leather mixed with the dust that seemed to accumulate no matter how often the place was swept. McCready sat behind a desk scarred by years of use, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to serious concern as Victoria laid out the evidence. The hidden brand mark, The investigation notes from her late husband, the pattern of thefts across 3 territories, the convenient connection between Dutch Calloway and Roscoe Jenkins, the timeline that didn't match Dutch's stated ownership history. Each piece alone might be circumstantial, but together they formed a picture that even the most skeptical observer would find troubling. Macready examined the sketch Silas had made of the brand, comparing it to the initials D.C. "You're certain this mark wasn't there when the horse was a foal?" "Positive," Silas replied. "I knew every inch of that colt, groomed him daily, checked him for injuries, monitored his health. No brands anywhere on his body. This was added after he was stolen." "And you found it behind the ear, concealed by the mane," Macready said thoughtfully. "That's not where a rancher brands for identification. That's where someone marks ownership they don't want easily discovered." He set the sketch down and picked up the folder of investigation notes. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband was thorough in his documentation. This is solid detective work." "He was a thorough man," Victoria said quietly. "It's one of the things that got him killed." Macready's eyes flicked up sharply. "You never filed formal accusations about your husband's death." "I had no proof, still don't, but I have beliefs based on pattern and probability. My husband opposed Dutch on a water rights issue, then he started investigating livestock thefts, then he died in a convenient accident. Connect those dots however you like, Sheriff." The lawman was quiet for a long moment, tapping his fingers against the desk. "What you're describing is a criminal conspiracy that crosses territorial lines. Rustling operations that large require multiple participants, including corrupt dealers willing to falsify documentation. If Dutch Calloway is involved, the way you suspect, bringing charges means taking on one of the wealthiest men in the region. He can afford lawyers I can't even pronounce the names of." "So we do nothing?" Silas asked, hearing the edge in his own voice. "Let him keep what he stole because he's got money and connections?" "I didn't say that," Macready replied. "I'm explaining what we're up against. This isn't going to be settled in my office with a handshake and an apology. This goes to court. It'll be months of legal proceedings. In the meantime, that horse is contested property. Dutch can file for seizure, claim you're harboring stolen goods. Judge might side with him based on his bill of sale, evidence or not." "Then what do we do?" Victoria asked. Macready stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. "We build an airtight case. I'll send telegrams to Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, every sheriff's office in the regions where those thefts occurred. I'll request cooperation from federal marshals since this crosses territorial boundaries. We document everything, find every witness we can, and we make this case so solid that Dutch's lawyers can't punch holes in it." "How long will that take?" Silas asked. "Weeks, maybe months," Macready admitted. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the reality of pursuing this properly." Silas shook his head. "Dutch won't wait weeks. He knows we found something had to have seen us riding into town. He'll move against us before we can finish building this case." "I'll assign a deputy to keep watch on Mrs. Ashford's ranch," Macready said. "If Dutch tries anything, we'll—" The door burst open. One of Macready's deputies stumbled in, young and breathless from running. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. Dutch Calloway's at the courthouse with his lawyers. He's filing for immediate seizure of property, says Mrs. Ashford, is harboring a stolen horse that belongs to him." Macready's jaw clenched. "How did he know to file today?" "Someone must have seen us come in," Victoria said. "Dutch has eyes all over town." The sheriff grabbed his hat and gun belt. "Let's go. With any luck, Judge Harrison will see through this for what it is, intimidation tactics." The courthouse stood at the end of Main Street, a 2-story brick building that represented law and order in Saint Denis. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of Dutch Calloway, and 3 suited lawyers standing in the main hall arguing with court officials. Dutch's expression when he saw them enter mixed triumph with contempt. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "Good timing. I'm filing for immediate return of my property currently being held illegally at Mrs. Ashford's ranch. That chestnut stallion was stolen from me, and I have documentation proving ownership. Funny thing about that documentation, Silas said, stepping forward, it's dated 6 months ago, but the horse has your brand mark from 3 years back. Care to explain that timeline? Dutch's eyes narrowed dangerously. Brand mark? I don't know what you're talking about. I've never branded that animal. Then you won't mind if the judge orders an examination, Macready interjected. Mr. Higgins has documented the location and nature of a brand bearing your initials placed on the horse approximately 3 years ago, right around the time the animal was stolen from his camp in Montana. One of Dutch's lawyers stepped forward. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of face that suggested he enjoyed finding loopholes more than seeking truth. Sheriff, my client's alleged brand is irrelevant. He has a legal bill of sale from a licensed trader. That document supersedes any speculation about markings that may or may not exist. The markings exist, Victoria said firmly, and they prove your client has been lying about when he acquired the horse. Combined with evidence of a pattern of livestock thefts across 3 territories, all connected to the same trading company that provided your convenient bill of sale, it paints a very clear picture. The lawyer's expression didn't change. Pictures aren't evidence, Mrs. Ashford. Documents are evidence. My client has documents. You have theories. Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers, drawn by the commotion. He was a man in his 60s, with a reputation for fairness that had survived 3 decades on the bench. What's all this noise about? The lawyers immediately began speaking over each other, but Harrison raised his hand for silence. One at a time, please. Mr. Calloway, you filed the motion. Explain your position. Dutch stepped forward, and Silas noted how quickly his expression shifted to one of reasonable injury. Your Honor, that stallion was purchased legally 6 months ago from Roscoe Jenkins of Wyoming. I paid good money for him, tried to train him proper, but he proved too dangerous. Sold him to the auction house, where this prospector somehow convinced everyone the horse was his through some kind of trick or deception. Now he and Mrs. Ashford are refusing to return my property. Mr. Higgins? Harrison looked at Silas. Your version? That horse was stolen from me 3 years ago in Montana, Silas said. I've been searching for him ever since, documented every step, found him at the auction, recognized him immediately. He recognized me too, responded to training and voice commands he couldn't have known unless I'd taught them to him as a colt. I purchased him legally for $10. Mr. Calloway's upset because his story doesn't match the evidence. Harrison considered this. Sheriff Macready, you've examined this evidence? I have, Your Honor. There are significant discrepancies in Mr. Calloway's timeline, including physical evidence that suggests he owned the horse before the date on his bill of sale. I believe this warrants a full investigation before any property seizure occurs. The judge looked at Dutch's lawyers. Gentlemen, I'm not prepared to order immediate seizure based on what I'm hearing. This requires proper examination. I'll schedule a hearing for 2 weeks from today. Until then, the horse remains with Mr. Higgins under Mrs. Ashford's care. Sheriff, I want a deputy assigned to ensure the animal isn't moved or tampered with. Dutch's face flushed red. Your Honor, that's my ruling, Harrison said firmly. 2 weeks, Mr. Calloway. Come prepared to explain why your alleged brand exists on a horse you claim to have purchased only 6 months ago. Court is adjourned. As the crowd dispersed, Dutch's eyes found Silas across the courthouse hall. The look he gave was pure hatred, barely contained. Then his gaze shifted to Victoria, and something in that glance made Silas's blood run cold. This wasn't over. The judge's ruling had only delayed the confrontation, not prevented it. Outside, Macready pulled them aside. I'm assigning Deputy Thomas to watch your ranch, Mrs. Ashford. He's young but reliable. Dutch is going to be angry about this ruling, and angry men make reckless decisions. I can protect my own property, Victoria said. I know you can, Macready replied, But humor me anyway. 2 weeks isn't long, but it's long enough for things to go wrong. Dutch has hired men who'll do whatever he pays them to do. Don't give them opportunities." They rode back to the ranch in tense silence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road, and Silas found himself scanning the tree line, looking for watchers. They'd won a temporary victory in the courthouse, but victories on paper didn't mean much if Dutch decided to take matters into his own hands. Back at the ranch, Silas went immediately to check on Copper. The stallion stood in his stall, ears forward at the sound of approaching footsteps. Silas entered and ran his hands over the horse's neck, feeling the solid warmth of living flesh, the steady heartbeat beneath the skin. "We've got 2 weeks," he told Copper quietly. 2 weeks to keep you safe while the law does its work. After that, either you're legally mine, or this turns into something uglier. Either way, I'm not losing you again. Not to Dutch, not to any court, not to anyone. You hear me? We've come too far for that." Copper nuzzled against his chest, seeking the comfort of familiar presence. Outside, Deputy Thomas took up position near the barn, rifle resting across his lap. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and the long Louisiana twilight settled over the ranch like a held breath waiting to be released. 2 weeks until the hearing. Silas had a feeling it wouldn't take that long for Dutch to make his move. The attack came on the 3rd night after the hearing. Silas had been sleeping in Copper's stall, old instincts telling him that Dutch wouldn't wait long to act. When the sound of breaking glass shattered the barn's quiet, he was awake and moving before his mind fully registered what was happening. Fire. Someone had thrown burning bottles through the barn windows, crude but effective accelerants that splashed across the wooden walls and caught in the hay. Flames spread with terrifying speed, feeding on dry straw and aged timber. Horses screamed in their stalls, the sound primal and desperate. Smoke began to fill the structure, thick and choking. Silas grabbed Copper's halter and flung open the stall door. The stallion reared, eyes rolling white with terror, but Silas held firm to the lead rope. "Easy, son. I've got you. Stay with me." His voice remained calm despite the chaos, that same steady tone he'd used 3 years ago when Copper was just a frightened colt. Other horses were panicking, kicking at their stalls. Silas could hear Deputy Thomas shouting outside, could see shadows moving beyond the smoke. He led Copper toward the main door, bent low beneath the smoke, one hand covering his nose and mouth with his shirt. The heat was building, the flames consuming the barn's interior with voracious hunger. They burst through the door into the cool night air. Silas's lungs burned as he dragged in clean oxygen, but he didn't stop moving. He could see the ranch hands emerging from their quarters, see Victoria running from the main house with a rifle in her hands, see Deputy Thomas trying to organize a response to the fire. And he saw Dutch Calloway's men waiting in the darkness beyond the firelight. There were 5 of them, mounted on horseback, positioned at strategic points around the burning barn. They weren't trying to help, they were waiting to see what would emerge from the flames. Waiting for Copper. "There," one of them shouted, pointing at Silas and the stallion. "That's the horse. Get him." 2 riders spurred forward. Silas backed up, putting himself between the approaching men and Copper. He had no weapon, nothing except his body and his will. The first rider reached them, swinging a rope to catch the stallion. Silas grabbed the rope mid-swing and pulled hard, using the rider's momentum against him. The man toppled from his saddle, hitting the ground with a grunt. The second rider was smarter. He circled wide, coming at Copper from the blind side. But Copper wasn't the terrified animal these men expected. 3 years of abuse hadn't erased the trust Silas had built. When Silas called out, "Back!" Copper responded instantly, backing away from the approaching threat, his training overriding his fear. A gunshot cracked through the night. Deputy Thomas had fired into the air, a warning. "Stand down, all of you, stand down right now." But Dutch's men weren't deterred by a single deputy. One of them drew his own pistol and fired not at Thomas, but at the ground near Copper's feet. The stallion reared, and Silas lost his grip on the lead rope. Copper bolted into the darkness, running blindly away from the fire and the chaos. "No!" Silas started after him, but strong hands grabbed his shoulders. Victoria's ranch foreman, a man named Carson, held him back. "Let him go. He'll circle back. Right now, we need to save the other horses." The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. 3 horses remained trapped inside, their screams cutting through the roar of fire. Silas made his decision in an instant. He tore free from Carson's grip and ran back toward the inferno. "Higgins, no!" Victoria's voice, sharp with command, but Silas was already moving. He grabbed a water bucket, dumped it over his head and shoulders, and plunged back into the burning structure. The heat hit him like a physical blow. Smoke filled his lungs despite his efforts to breathe through wet fabric. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, had to navigate by memory and the sound of terrified horses. The first stall held a young mare who'd been too frightened to move when her door was opened. Silas grabbed her halter and dragged her forward, using force now because gentleness would get them both killed. They made it to the door. He shoved the mare toward waiting hands and turned back. 2 more horses. The barn groaned around him, timbers beginning to fail. Somewhere above, the hayloft was collapsing. He had minutes at most. The second horse came easier, already near panic enough to follow any leadership. But the third, an old gelding who'd spent 20 years in this barn, had backed into the far corner of his stall, paralyzed by fear. Silas approached, speaking softly, knowing he was spending seconds he didn't have. "Come on, old-timer. Can't die here. Not tonight. Not like this." Behind him, the barn's main support beam cracked with a sound like thunder. The roof was coming down. Silas grabbed the old gelding's halter and pulled with every ounce of strength left in his smoke-filled lungs. The horse resisted for one more agonizing second, then instinct overcame paralysis. They lurched forward together as the roof beam gave way behind them, crashing down into the stall they'd just vacated. Debris rained around them, burning fragments catching in Silas's hair and clothes. Hands reached through the doorway, Carson and 2 other ranch hands, forming a human chain. They grabbed the gelding's halter and pulled, then grabbed Silas and dragged him clear, just as the entire hayloft collapsed inward with a roar like a living thing dying. The barn that had stood for 30 years was gone in minutes, reduced to a burning shell that would smolder until morning. Silas collapsed onto the ground, coughing violently. His clothes were singed, his hands blistered, his lungs screaming for clean air. Victoria knelt beside him, her face smudged with soot. "You damn fool," she said, but her voice held relief rather than anger. "You could have died in there." "Horses," Silas managed between coughs. Couldn't leave them. "They're safe. All of them safe because of you." She helped him sit up, pressing a water skin into his hands. "But Copper ran. He's out there somewhere in the dark." Silas's head cleared enough to remember. The stallion had bolted when the gunshot startled him. 3 years of searching, and now Copper was lost again, this time because of Dutch's deliberate violence. The rage that filled Silas then was cleaner and colder than any fire. He struggled to his feet, despite Victoria's protests. Deputy Thomas approached, his young face grim. Dutch's men scattered when the sheriff arrived with reinforcements. McCready's tracking them now. "But Mr. Higgins, I'm sorry I couldn't stop them before they—" "Not your fault," Silas said, his voice rough from smoke. "They knew exactly what they were doing. Fire was meant to panic everyone, make us choose between saving horses and stopping theft. While we fought the blaze, they planned to take Copper in the confusion." "It was attempted murder," Victoria said flatly. "That fire could have killed you, could have killed all of us. Dutch has crossed a line he can't uncross. First we find Copper," Silas said. "Then we deal with Dutch." He took a horse from Victoria's remaining stock, a steady mare who didn't spook easily, and rode out into the darkness. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to see by once his eyes adjusted. He followed the direction Copper had run, reading signs in the disturbed grass and broken branches. The stallion's panic had been immediate but not blind. He'd run in a relatively straight line, heading away from the fire and noise. Silas found him a half-mile from the ranch, standing in a small clearing near a creek. Copper's sides heaved, foam flecked his neck, and his eyes still showed white at the edges. But when Silas dismounted and began humming that old lullaby, the stallion's ears swiveled forward. Recognition cut through fear. "There you are," Silas said softly, approaching with empty hands. "There's my good boy. I know you were scared. I was scared too, but we're both alive, and that's what matters." Copper took 3 hesitant steps forward, then closed the distance in a rush, pressing his forehead against Silas's chest, hard enough to knock the old prospector back a step. The horse made that same mournful sound he'd made in the auction house, a question without words. "Why does this keep happening? Why can't we just be safe?" "I know," Silas murmured, wrapping his arms around Copper's neck. "I know, son, but it's almost over. Dutch showed his hand tonight, tried to kill us both. That's not something the law can ignore, no matter how much money he's got." The sound of approaching horses made both man and stallion tense, but it was Sheriff Macready and 3 deputies, along with Victoria on horseback. Macready's expression was thunderous. "We caught 2 of Dutch's men trying to flee toward the Circle C," the sheriff said without preamble. "They're talking, trying to make deals. Said Dutch paid them to start the fire and steal the horse. Said it wasn't the first time he'd hired them for such work." He paused, his jaw clenched. "They also admitted to sabotaging the fence that killed Mrs. Ashford's husband." Victoria went very still. "They admitted it?" Once they realized they were facing hanging for attempted murder, they decided cooperation might save their necks. "Dutch is in custody. His lawyers are already screaming, but I've got signed confessions from 2 witnesses. That's enough to hold him while we build the full case." Silas felt something loosen in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for 3 years, finally beginning to release. "So it's over." "The immediate danger is," Macready confirmed. "The legal proceedings will take time, but Dutch won't be walking free anytime soon, and his operation is finished. Every sheriff in 3 territories will be investigating his connections now. Roscoe Jenkins is probably already running for Mexico." Copper nuzzled at Silas's shoulder, seeking reassurance. The old prospector ran his hands down the stallion's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat gradually slowing. "Hear that, boy? We can go home now. Well, once we figure out where home is." "You've got a home as long as you need one," Victoria said quietly. "My barn's gone, but we'll rebuild. Could use a head groom who actually understands horses the way they deserve to be understood." Silas looked at her, then at the gathered men, then back at Copper. Of searching, of having nothing except determination and a worn journal. The idea of staying in one place, of having steady work and a purpose beyond survival, felt both foreign and deeply appealing. "We'll talk about that," he said finally. "After things settle, after the hearing that proves Copper belongs to me legally and not just morally." They rode back to the ranch together, Silas leading Copper and Victoria riding beside him. Behind them, the ruins of the barn still glowed with residual heat, but ahead the main house stood intact, lights burning in the windows. Damaged, but not destroyed. Much like Silas himself, come to think of it. The hearing took place on a morning when autumn had finally surrendered to winter's first breath. The courthouse filled with spectators drawn by the scandal Dutch Calloway, once untouchable, now facing multiple charges of theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder. His lawyers had abandoned him one by one as the evidence mounted. The confessions from his hired men, the investigation notes from Victoria's late husband, the telegram from Roscoe Jenkins, arrested in Wyoming, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. The hidden brand mark on Copper's neck that no legitimate owner would have placed there. Silas sat in the front row wearing clothes that Victoria had insisted on buying him proper trousers and a clean shirt, though he'd refused the offered tie. Copper was stabled at a temporary facility the court had approved, under guard to prevent any further interference. 3 weeks had passed since the fire. 3 weeks of depositions and investigations and legal procedures that moved with the grinding slowness of institutional justice. Judge Harrison entered, and the courtroom rose. The judge's expression gave nothing away as he settled into his seat and reviewed the papers before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had required careful consideration. In the matter of ownership of one chestnut stallion, 4 years of age, I find for the plaintiff, Silas Higgins. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Calloway's documentation was fraudulent, obtained through conspiracy with a known dealer in stolen livestock. Furthermore, physical evidence, specifically the brand mark placed on the animal approximately 3 years ago, directly contradicts Mr. Calloway's stated timeline of ownership. Harrison looked directly at Silas. Mr. Higgins, your persistence in searching for this animal speaks to a connection that transcends monetary value. Your documentation, while unconventional, demonstrates a genuine bond and legitimate claim. The horse is legally yours, free and clear of any competing ownership. Relief washed through Silas with such intensity that he had to grip the bench in front of him to stay upright. 3 years. 3 years of searching, of sacrifice, of refusing to give up when everyone else would have moved on. And now, finally, it was over. Copper was his, recognized by law as well as bond. Outside the courthouse, Victoria waited with Sheriff Macready. The sheriff extended his hand. Congratulations, Mr. Higgins. Justice doesn't always work out this clean, but when it does, it's worth celebrating. Thank you, Sheriff, for believing me when you had no reason to. Had every reason, Macready replied. Honest men are easier to spot than liars if you know what to look for. You never wavered in your story, never embellished to make yourself look better. That told me everything I needed to know. Victoria offered to drive Silas to the temporary stable where Copper waited. They rode in comfortable silence until she spoke. The barn's been rebuilt. Not as large as before, but solid, new timber, proper fire prevention. I meant what I said about having a place for you both. Silas considered the offer, really considered it this time. Instead of deflecting out of habit or pride, he had nowhere else to go. His Montana claim was long abandoned, claimed by whoever had filed on it after he left. He had no family waiting anywhere, no home to return to, just a horse, a worn journal, and a leather pouch that held what remained of 3 years' worth of gold dust. I'm 62 years old, he said finally. Not sure how many good working years I've got left in me. I'm 48, Victoria replied. Not sure how many years of managing a ranch alone I've got left in me. Seems like we could both benefit from partnership, not charity, not obligation. Just two people who understand that worth isn't measured in youth or wealth. They arrived at the stable. Copper stood in a large paddock, his coat gleaming in the winter sunlight. The scars were still visible, but they'd faded to white lines against chestnut testimony to survival rather than defeat. When Copper saw Silas, his head came up immediately, ears forward. He walked to the fence, reaching over to nuzzle the old prospector's face. "Did you hear that, boy?" Silas said softly, running his hands over the familiar contours of Copper's head. "We've got a home now. A real one, not just camps and trails." Copper huffed out a breath that stirred the hair around Silas's face. It might have been agreement, or just a horse being a horse, but Silas chose to interpret it as approval. They returned to Victoria's ranch that afternoon, Victoria's and now Silas's too, in a way that felt right, despite being unfamiliar. The rebuilt barn stood clean and solid, ready to house horses that would be treated with the respect all living creatures deserved. The paddock stretched toward the horizon, offering space for Copper to run and heal, and remember what it felt like to be free without being lost. That evening, as the sun set over Louisiana's rolling hills, Silas stood at the paddock fence, watching Copper graze. The stallion moved with increasing ease, the tension that had defined him at the auction house gradually dissolving. Time would complete what reunion had begun. Already, Copper would approach without hesitation, would accept a halter without fight, would stand calmly for grooming and care. Victoria joined him at the fence, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. She offered one to Silas, and they stood in companionable silence as the light faded and stars began to emerge. "You know what I've learned?" Silas said finally. 3 years ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing him, thought the raiders took everything that mattered. But searching for him taught me something about persistence, about refusing to accept that wrong can't be made right, and finding him taught me that some bonds survive time and distance and cruelty. That's worth knowing. "Your father would be proud," Victoria said. "The man who taught you that a horse remembers kindness longer than pain. He'd say I was a damn fool for spending 3 years chasing a single horse across half the country," Silas replied. Then he smiled slightly, "But he'd understand why I did it." They watched Copper move through the twilight, a ghost of chestnut against darkening grass. Tomorrow would bring new work, new routines, new challenges. But tonight, in this moment, everything that needed to be right was right. The searching was over, the finding complete, and the future, for the first time in 3 years, held something more than the next town, the next lead, the next hope that might end in disappointment. It held home. For a man and a horse who'd both learned that being lost and being found were 2 sides of the same hard-won truth, that worth persists even when circumstances try to destroy it, and that some connections, once properly forged, can never truly be broken. In the distance, Copper raised his head and called out, not in distress or fear, but simply acknowledging the presence of someone who mattered. Silas answered with that old lullaby, the one that had bridged 3 years and 1,000 miles. And in the gathering darkness, man and horse stood together, finally home.